Welcome to the fifth and the last lecture on German institutions. When I left you last time, I talked about what I call the traditional three political parties. The Christian Democrats, Christian Socialists, I consider them one party. The Christian Democrats are the main party. The Christian Socialists run as their affiliate in Bavaria, but for all intents and purposes, they are one political party, and Angela Merkel has been their leader for the last 15 years. In this particular case, I have told you that every single German prime minister has had to govern with a coalition. After the 2013 election, Merkel had to form a coalition with their enemies, their rivals, if you will, the Social Democrats, in what Roskin calls a grand coalition. And even though there were six political parties represented in the Bundestag after the 2017 election, rather than the four that were represented after the 2013 election, Merkel is still governing in that grand coalition. So the Christian Democrats, Christian Socialists are in a coalition with the Social Democrats. Now, the norm historically was usually the Free Democrats were the alliance partner, the coalition partner. That's not always true. I told you that the Social Democrats actually for 7 years were in a coalition with the Green Party. But if you take a look at the six political parties, and let me explain what I call the three newcomers. So up until the 1983 election, there really was a three-party system the way I see it in Germany, and those are the three parties I talked about last time. The Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and then the Free Democrats. Over the last approximately 40 years, there have been three newcomers that have been added to the Bundestag, and the first of these are the Greens. So the Greens are an environmental party. They first qualified for representation in the Bundestag in 1983. This, as Roskin points out, is a leftist party that embraces both ecology and pacifism. They were the junior coalition partner with the Social Democrats from 1998 to 1995, and in recent elections, they've received about 8 to 9% of the vote, 8% in 2013, 9% in 2017. And here I want to talk about this notion that leftist parties or even right-wing parties may have internal divisions. And certainly one of the problems that exist not just in Germany but in many European countries are that green parties are interested in protecting the environment. And so, for example, green parties typically want to put huge taxes on fossil fuels, especially, let's say, gasoline. I know in one election, the Greens advocated basically a $10 a gallon tax on gasoline. Well, as you might imagine, the Social Democrats, the socialists, were probably the party who were the most opposed to this. The Social Democrats argued that this is a tax that is going to disproportionately hurt lower income people, that millionaires aren't going to care what the tax is on gasoline. They're going to be able to afford it no matter what, and that this is hurting poorer people. So you have socialists and communists who essentially are interested in creating greater material equity. They're interested in bread and butter issues. And the Greens are interested in the environment. They want to do things that, for example, they might oppose a nuclear fuel. They oppose fossil fuel. They're interested in renewables. They're interested in geothermal and wind and tidal and solar and various other things that are renewable, and this can create a rift between them. So just because the Greens are considered a leftist party, that does not mean that the Greens don't pose significant problems for other parties that consider themselves left. With the reunification of Germany in the 1990s, we get another political split, that traditional north-south split that still exists, right? The northern part of Germany is Protestant, it's more liberal. You're much more likely to see a lot of social democratic support in the north, and in the south, you see a more Catholic region, you see a much more conservative, and that's been around since this republic. Heck, this goes back centuries, this split. But when reunification occurred, the formerly East German states were now part of Germany, and the former East Germans were much more liberal. You had a lot of socialists, the former communists. They wanted their region, their 6 states, to be brought up to the standards of West Germany. These Germans who were living in the eastern part of Germany had very different political values. They'd lived under communist rule. And so a new political party emerged called the Party of Democratic Socialism. This party in 2005 renamed itself the Left. And so the left are not just the former communists of Eastern Europe, but the left are also people who have abandoned the socialists, the Social Democratic Party, believing that that party has moved too far to the center. And so a lot of the former leftists in the Socialist Party have joined this party, the left. This party, like the Greens, receives, at least in the last 2 elections, about 9% of the vote. Roskin points out in 2013, the left got 9% of the vote. In the last election that Roskin does not mention, in 2017, they received 9.2% of the vote, and they received 69 seats in the Bundestag. Now, in this last election in 2017, we got a brand new political party, and I will tell you that this surprised me quite a bit. This sixth party was formed in 2013. The party, I believe, got 4.8% of the vote, so they barely missed the 5% threshold in 2013. So this party is not mentioned in Roskin. However, in 2017, this party received a significant percentage of the vote. They received 12.6% of the vote, and this party has 94 seats in the Bundestag. So this is a party known as the AfD. It's a very far right-wing party. I believe that this German Nationalist Party is even to the right of the National Front in France. It's anti-European, it's anti-immigrant, it's anti-Islamic, and what bothers me isn't necessarily that it's an anti-EU party. Even saying that, we want to limit immigration, although given the demographic problem of Germany, the fact that their fertility rate is so small, only 1.4. This is a country that actually needs immigrants, in my opinion. But what bothers me is that when I read articles and some of their leaders make speeches, it has tinges right out of the Nazi era, and certainly given the Nazi past of this country, this is something that is very, very worrisome to me. Now, to conclude the party's discussion, I know last year I had a student who asked me, well, Randall, there's 6 political parties in the Bundestag. What are the prospects of a 7th party, an 8th party, a 10th party, a 12th party, etc.? And I said, well, not very good. And I'm not saying that a 7th party couldn't form, but here's the problem. Remember, there is a 5% threshold in the German political system. In other words, a political party must receive 5% of the vote nationwide, or actually outright win constituencies. And so to me, we're probably getting to the outer range. 6 parties I guess in theory, maybe you could have a seventh party, but I think that this is probably about as far as we go. And my guess is that in the future we're going to bounce back and forth. There's going to be some elections where maybe only four parties are represented, maybe some where five, maybe some that are six. Could a seventh party emerge? I guess it's possible, but I think we're about on the outer limits of what's possible. Now, in the last 4.5 minutes of this mini lecture, I do want to mention the Bundesrat. I told you that Germany is one of the few countries in Europe that has a meaningful upper house. In both Britain and France, we didn't have that, right? We did on paper have bicameral legislatures in both Britain and France. But I pointed out that the upper houses, the House of Lords and the Senate, had little power, and the lower house could simply override any objections. In the case of Germany, a upper house to me is really only necessary if you have federalism. Federalism is important because a chamber can represent the people and a chamber can represent the states. In our case, the House of Representatives is based largely on population, and yet the Senate represents the states equally. So the Bundesrat is that link in Germany. The Bundesrat is the link between the national government and the states. The Bundesrat is the defender of state interests. Members of the Bundesrat are appointed by the state governments themselves. That may seem strange, but keep in mind in the United States, originally senators were chosen by their state legislatures. So essentially, the Germans have representation in the Bundesrat the way we used to represent our senators. Our states used to, in the old days before the 17th Amendment, our state legislatures nominated and appointed our senators to represent our state. It's no longer true. It hasn't been true for over 100 years. But that would be the closest frame of reference I would have to the way Bundesrat members are elected. I pointed out that the Bundesrat can effectively veto about 60% of legislation. If you look in various books, I've seen 50%. I've seen figures up to 2/3. Any measures that directly impact the states can be vetoed. About the other 40% of legislation, the Bundestag can in fact override the Bundesrat. So it's not quite the American model. In the United States, every bill, right, to become a law has to be passed in identical form in both the House and the Senate. And that's not true in the German case. I would point out, and it's not really important for any reasons. It was a silly error. It was probably made by one of Roskin's graduate students, but there is a minor error in the textbook. Your textbook says that there are 68 members in the German Bundesrat. There are actually 69 members in the Bundesrat. To me, the most interesting feature, and I have it start in your notes. To me, the most interesting feature about the Bundesrat is that Bundesrat members must vote as a bloc, not as individuals. For example, in a small state that's represented by 3 members, and large states are represented by 6. So if you were to go online and look up the Bundesrat, you'll find states that have 3, 4, 5, and 6 members representing them. But all of them must vote either yes or no on legislation. Remember, they are there to represent a state. So as a bloc, they are deciding whether it is in their state's interests or not. They cannot vote independently. At the end of the notes, I just wanted you to consider something, and that is, to me, this graduated weighting of seats in the German states is a compromise between the American Senate, where all states are represented equally, and the Germans try to factor population in a bit, and I kind of like this. I think it's kind of an interesting idea, and I've wondered, what would the U.S. Senate look like if our small states had, say, 2 senators, our medium states had 3, and our larger states had 4. There is a typo. I just noticed that. If you look at your last sentence, it says, what would the U.S. Senate look like? It look like the Bundestag. It should say the Bundesrat, and would it be desirable? I just wonder your thoughts. Let me know.